Hello. I've got quite a bit to go through today. I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as... Is this on?
Yeah.
Yep. I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible. I'm hoping that some of the basic stuff you'll already be aware of, but I'll just quickly run through just to make sure we're all working off the same basis. And hopefully, although I can't guarantee it, there'll be time for questions at the end. The Biodiversity Conservation Act is replacing the Wildlife Conservation Act, the Sandalwood Act and the associated regulations with the intention of bringing a modern day biodiversity conservation legislation to Western Australia. The Act got assent on the 21st of September 2016 with partial proclamation on the 3rd of December 2016. The partial proclamation was for those bits that weren't reliant on regulations. And these were such things as biodiversity management programs, conservation covenants and conservation agreements. But we do require regulations to replace what were previously managed or regulated under the Wildlife Conservation Regulations and the Sandalwood Act or Sandalwood Regulations. And that's what we're currently working on now. Using guiding principles, standard guiding principles from government on streamlining regulatory reform and trying to make things nice for everybody. The regulations, what we weren't aware of, no one told us, that in the Act we had 24 months to develop the regulations to enable us to do what's called transitional arrangements. We only found out about that sort of about 10 months after the Act got passed. So we've been frantically trying to develop the regulations, so it's been done all as a bit of a rush to try and get the transitional arrangements. There's about 14,000 licences, Wildlife Conservation Act licences that we issue each year, and we need the transition arrangements in place to allow us to transition those licences directly into the equivalent Biodiversity Conservation Act licences without having to reissue them. So if we fail in getting the regulations through, we've got to issue 14,000 licences in one day, which won't be very pleasant for everyone. So that's an incentive for us to try and achieve that. So we need to have the regulations in place by the 21st of September this year, with a proposal that they will come into operation on the 1st of January next year. So that will give us another 3 months on to do consultation and the like on the actual regulations. There are two aspects of the regulations that are specific and applicable here. That is the new licensing arrangements and also new arrangements for threatened species, especially protected species, ecological communities, key threatening processes and critical habitat. The two areas that I'll mainly concentrate on today are more applicable to people in this audience. The licensing and the threatened species and communities type of aspects. So biodiversity licensing. The existing Wildlife Conservation Act and Sandalwood Act licences will hopefully transition to new Biodiversity Conservation Act licences. In general, there are applicable types that do correlate, so we can just do that straight across. The new licence applies so where a new licence applies, there won't be a requirement to take out that licence until the 1st of January or after your existing licence expires. So if you've got an existing licence which has been transitioned, you won't need to take out a new licence until that licence expires. But if there's a new licence type, then it'll be the 1st of January. There's some simplification being done in the licensing system, so where there were various licences which overlapped in nature, we're combining those together to try and make it simpler in the application process. For example, some of the pet categories for pet licences have been amalgamated to reduce the number of categories and amalgamating similar licensed activities. As required by government, there's also a review of licensing fees being undertaken with the government policy of a full cost recovery that we have to implement. So we are currently in the process of doing that. We have got a preliminary idea of licence fees that we're going to be putting to government for their approval. Most of the new licence fees, or many of them will have a modest increase, but nothing very much. And given that licence fees have not really changed very much in the years, there'll be a small licence fee, but in some cases there will actually be a reduction in the licence fee. And we're proposing that there will be, for a lot of the licences, there will be an initial licence cost, and then when the licence is renewed, we'll have a capacity for doing renewal of licences, and renewed licences will have a reduced cost. So once that initial assessment's been done up front for the first licence, then renewals can be done at a reduced cost. And there will be also options in many cases for multi-year licences to be able to be put in place. In new licence types, in the flora and the sandwood industry, dealers and processors will be licensed for the first time. Licensing dealers was actually a recommendation in the 1988 Wildflower Industry Review Committee report, so it's not that we don't move quickly, it's just that we don't move quickly. So that's coming in. That allows for greater management and regulation of the flora harvesting industry. There will also be a specific bioprospecting licence. Currently we do bioprospecting under flora provisions of both the CALM Act and the Wildlife Conservation Act, but there isn't any provision for fauna bioprospecting. So under the Biodiversity Conservation Act there will be a capacity of bioprospecting licences for both flora and fauna. And of interest here is there will be a new category of a biological survey licence or a salvage relocation licence for fauna. The reason for this being is that that wasn't really taken into account when the Wildlife Conservation Act was first written back in the dim dark days of the past. And the Wildlife Conservation Act said that you had to have a commercial licence for commercial purposes. It didn't say for selling the flora, it just said if you're taking the flora for a commercial purpose, and then there was a scientific or other prescribed purposes licence where it was being done for science or anything that was non-commercial. Undertaking biological surveys by consultants sort of fits in between that. You don't take the flora itself to sell the flora, but you are being paid to take the flora for a commercial thing. So what we've always been done as a policy position on the Wildlife Conservation Act is to turn a slightly blind eye and to treat that as a research licence under the scientific or other prescribed purposes licence, but to make it more clear now there'll be a specific biological survey licence. That licence these licences can be project specific, as the fauna ones currently are, or annual licences as the flora ones currently are. So there will be an option where you want to do project specific licences, or if you want to take out an annual licence. For fauna, it requires more specific detail about how you're undertaking a licensed activity than for flora. So for fauna, if you're able to describe the techniques that you're going to use for all of the surveys that you're doing, using standard operating procedures or something similar, then you can take out a licence for a prescribed period and undertake any activities that are the same as that licensed activity, or how you describe how you're going to do it over that time period. And there'll be the option for being able to do that for multiple years. The persons who are actually doing the taking have to be licensed. We did investigate whether we could issue licences at the company level, but we aren't able to under the Act. So the actual taking of licence, the actual licence of taking has to be to an individual who's doing the activity. But we are able to include authorised persons on those licence, where you have other people assisting you in the field doing work that's not actually directly related to the taking of the flora. So where you have a project team and certain people, or flora or fauna, so we have a project team and you have a team leader who's actually doing the taking and whatnot, but is supervising other people to assist in the work in the field, then those people can be listed on your licence and don't have to have that separate licence. There are some situations where we can license the business. This tends to be things like in the flora industry, the dealer's premises or a processing plant can be licensed, and that covers the people working in that situation. We're developing a new biodiversity licensing system to try and make this easier and simpler for everyone to work through. There's an online system being developed which will allow for applications, amendments, permits to be applied for, plus notifications and submission of returns. So we're looking at it being a one-stop shop for everything that you need to do for your licences. And there will be a single login based on your email address, which will allow you access into the system to see all of your licences and to manage your licences as you see fit, either submitting notifications to the department where you're going to be working in a specific area, or submitting licence returns and things of that nature. There will be the ability for multiple licences to be applied for at the same time if they are related. Again, the flora industry is the easiest one to give examples for, but if a wildflower picker is also a dealer and going to be doing processing, then they can tick the 3 boxes and apply for all 3 activities at the one time. Now, something which is a little bit different, which may be applicable or which you might find interesting, is the system will allow businesses to link themselves to specific licensees and for licensees to link themselves to specific businesses. So a business might have a number of licensees working for them, and they can all be linked into the business account, and the business has an account manager who can basically manage those licences. They'll be able to go in and see who's got licences, when they're due to expire, whether returns have been submitted and things of that nature. So an ability to manage their licences. There's also the ability for the company or for the licensee to link themselves to the company as well, so that they are related to that company as far as how they are taking their licence out. Now, as I said, you get into the system by using your email address. If you work for a company, you'll be able to use your company email address, and then that links you in there. But of course, if you then shift company, you then become a different person as far as the system is concerned. So the option is there as to whether you, if a company is paying for your licence, for example, they may require you to log on and take the licence out on their name using their company email. But if you are a consultant, for example, and working for a number of companies, then you would use your own personal email and then link yourself to those companies. So it's just a flexible way of allowing you to manage your licences and manage the licences of people who work for you. So that's licensing. Now looking at arrangements for listing of threatened species, quickly go through. The system that we are looking at is basically a reflection of the existing policy position of the department, where we use international standards in listing of threatened species, and also have there's a national memorandum of understanding on listing of threatened species, which we are signatory to. The state is a signatory to, and that provides guidance on process as well. So essentially, the system which is being promoted for in the Biodiversity Conservation Act is a reflection of those international and national standards. The listing of species will be using the IUCN categories of critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, extinct and extinct in the wild. And the Act provides for substantial increases in penalties, up to $500,000 for impact to a critically endangered species, or under the Sentencing Act, it can be 5 times that for a corporation, so we're looking at up to $2.5 million for impact to a critically endangered species. So quite significant penalties. The Act provides for public nominations and feedback processes on the listing of threatened species, and the Minister must consider scientific advice, which it is proposed will be through the existing Threatened Species Scientific Committee. The ministerial guidelines, there was ministerial guidelines being developed and required under the Act, which provides a greater detail for how things like listing of threatened species is to occur. and these are recommending that we use the IUCN criteria. And just to clarify, there's no proposed change to priority species. They're not considered under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, as they were not under the Wildlife Conservation Act. But as Denise said, they do get taken into account as biodiversity values in the Environmental Protection Act. Threatened ecological communities. Greg Carey will be talking on this tomorrow, but just a quick background to them. They currently don't have any legislative basis. It's a policy position to list threatened ecological communities, but they do get recognised as an environmentally sensitive area under the EP Act. The criteria that we have used to list the species in Western Australia are not the same as the new ones that have been developed nationally and internationally. We developed our criteria a long time before these sorts of things came out. And the international criteria, the red list for ecosystems, criteria under IUCN, is what is being proposed in the again in the national MOU that we haven't signed yet, but we are looking to ensure that our systems are consistent with that, so we can sign up to it in the future. So we're aiming for legislative changes and eventual alignment of our TECs that make it compatible with national and international standards. So we'll be listing TECs as critically endangered, vulnerable and collapsed. So the current category of presumed destroyed will become collapsed. And again, as with threatened species, there's public nominations. The Minister must take advice, which will again is being proposed to be under the TEC Scientific Committee. And using the red list criteria. There are currently 69 communities listed as either threatened ecological communities or the presumed destroyed, which would take quite some time to assess those against the new criteria. So it's proposed that we will transition the existing threatened ecological community list into the first list under the Biodiversity Conservation Act without assessing them against the new criteria, but with the intention that they'll gradually be this is news for you, Greg, by the way. That they'll gradually be assessed over time, and any new nominations will have to be assessed against the new criteria. And again, the same sort of penalties as for threatened species. Managing threatened species and TECs, there'll be a requirement to issue, or there's an ability, to issue notices to landowners, so letting them know that they've got TECs or threatened species on their land. We currently do this for TECs and threatened flora. But where a notice under the Act is issued, well, the owner will be required to notify us if there's a change of ownership, so we can keep a track of that, and also to notify any visitors onto the land that the threatened species or ecological communities exist there. And there's also legislative ability in the Act for doing recovery plans, which have to be approved by the Minister, or interim recovery plans approved by the CEO. Applicable to this gathering here is under the Act, there is a requirement for anyone undertaking a environmental impact assessment as part of the Part 4 or Part 5 of the EP Act to notify the Department of the presence of threatened species or threatened ecological communities. So the issue where a lot of consultants have been constrained in the past of advising the Department of occurrence of threatened species because of confidentiality clauses or commercial and confidence aspects with proponents will not apply in that the Act says that you do have to notify us. There is a defence where you didn't know that it was a threatened species at the time, but then there's a requirement to advise us once you do realise that there is a threatened species there. There's also a requirement for authorisation to have a requirement for an authorisation, which is like a permit to take, for both threatened fauna as well as the threatened flora which currently exists. So where currently you're getting a threatened flora or a permit to take rare flora for doing your environmental impact assessment work, you'll also need one for threatened fauna. We recognise that there is an issue where if you put a trap out, you don't know what's going to go in the trap. So there's obviously going to have to be a precautionary approach with people doing biological surveys, that where there is a chance or a likelihood that a threatened species may be in the area, then you need to ensure that you do have a threatened fauna permit. Obviously, we need to work through a few of the practicalities of that and how to address that. There's also a requirement to notify where a TEC is modified. And when we say modified, we don't mean just slightly impact, as in with threatened flora, but where it is actually destroyed or impacted to the degree that it will not regenerate or grow back its species composition or structure. Very quickly, there's an ability to list specially protected species, as we have currently for threatened fauna, and these are essentially species that we regard as conservation dependent, and migratory species which we currently have. There's also an ability to list cetaceans and species subject to international agreements and otherwise in need of special protection. The only two that we're currently not listing is the cetaceans and the species subject to international agreement. It's proposed that we will not list those under the specially protected fauna provisions, because cetaceans have a special level of protection under the Act anyhow, which is higher than if they were listed as otherwise specially protected. So in fact it's a nonsense to list them as otherwise specially protected. And in fact you cannot list a species as other specially protected if it's also listed as threatened, which means that any list of cetaceans wouldn't be complete, so it would be causing confusions. So my recommendation has been that we do not list cetaceans separately. And similarly, international agreements are mainly things like the migratory bird agreements and Bonn Convention, which will be picked up under the migratory species anyway. The penalties for other specially protected, 200,000 or 5 times that for a corporation. And again, there'll be ministerial guidelines for how to list. Key threatening processes is a new concept. It's currently is available through the DBCA Act and will be picked up under the Biodiversity Conservation Act. There is the same sort of nomination process for these as for threatened species and communities. But with key threatening processes, there's not actually anything in the Act which says you have to do anything about it. So it's really an awareness raising thing, something which can be brought out in recovery plans and generally raise attention to it, but there's no requirement for landholders to actually undertake remedial actions. Critical habitat is a new provision. This is habitat which is really the major essential areas of habitat for listed species or communities, and they'll be listed on the register. There's no nomination process per se, but they may be identified through the recovery planning process. There has been direct consultation with landholders before being listed. The critical habitat actually doesn't have any penalty if you impact critical habitat. The only penalty provisions under the Act is where there's a habitat conservation notice applied to the critical habitat, which says that the landowner has to do certain actions to either stop something happening or remediate something which has happened. As a consequence, we're only proposing that critical habitat would be listed if there is a threatening process that's impacting on that habitat, and that a habitat conservation notice can and should be applied to it. Otherwise it's not having any real benefit. And the penalties that apply to contravening a habitat conservation notice are the same level as for the species and communities, depending on the threat category of those species and communities. So they're only for really exceptional circumstances. And again, ministerial guidelines have been prepared for these. So the ministerial guidelines I mentioned a few times. This is how the minister will agree to how these listing processes are going to be undertaken for threatened species and communities and the like. And the minister will publish these, and they will be published prior to the Act come into effect. There's opportunity for some for consultation. There'll be a consultation webpage set up on the DBA site under the Plants and Animals section under the Biodiversity Conservation Act, and a series of discussion notes and information notes are being prepared and will be placed on that on that site for different sectors. So there's one on environmental consultants, there's one on flora industry, there's one on fauna industry and things of that nature. So we are hoping we've got a number of these information sheets up with the Minister at present being signed off, and once they are signed off, we'll be starting to put those up on the website. So I'd encourage you to access that website in the near future and go back and revisit it to see what information gets put up there. Thank you.